You've been in rooms where you should have felt at home. Rooms full of people who share your interests, your background, your values. Groups that should have been your people. Communities built around exactly the things that matter to you. And you stood at the edge of them, watching, wondering why the feeling of belonging that everyone else seemed to have so easily was not arriving. Not because you were excluded. You were included, invited, welcomed, but something in you remained slightly outside, watching from a distance that existed entirely inside you, entirely invisible to anyone else, entirely unexplainable when you tried to put words to it. You thought you would feel it by now, the sense of having found your place, your people, the version of yourself that finally fits somewhere. You haven't. Here's what that experience actually is. Not shyness, not introversion, not the inevitable result of being different in some fundamental way that makes you permanently incompatible with belonging. It is a specific psychological condition, one that develops in response to particular experiences, one that distorts the way belonging is perceived, and one that produces the specific, exhausting feeling of being an outsider everywhere, even in rooms specifically designed to include you. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why you never feel like you belong. What the research says is actually happening in the brain when belonging is registered, or not. And why the problem is almost certainly not that you don't belong somewhere. It's that something is interfering with your ability to feel it when you do. There is a researcher named Gregory Walton at Stanford University. He has spent years studying what he calls belonging uncertainty, the chronic, often unconscious questioning of whether you truly fit in any particular social context, whether your presence there is real and permanent or conditional and fragile, whether at some level you are genuinely one of them. His research has found something that changes how you understand the experience of not belonging. Belonging uncertainty is not primarily about actual exclusion. People can be objectively included, their contributions valued, their presence welcomed, their membership in the group clearly established, and still experience profound belonging uncertainty. Because belonging uncertainty is not about what is true about your status in the group, it is about what your brain believes is true. And that belief was formed long before the current group existed. The brain arrives at any new social situation not as a blank slate, but with a prior, an existing model of how social inclusion works based on previous experience. For some people, that prior is optimistic. Social inclusion is the baseline expectation. New groups are approached with the assumption of welcome. The default interpretation of ambiguous social signals is benign. For others, that prior is pessimistic. Social inclusion is uncertain. New groups are approached with vigilance. Ambiguous social signals are interpreted as potential evidence of the exclusion that feels most familiar. Which prior you carry is largely determined by the experiences that built it. The belonging uncertainty that makes you feel like an outsider in rooms designed to include you is, almost always, a prior built from earlier experiences of genuine exclusion, or from environments where belonging was conditional, or from a version of yourself, perhaps different, perhaps unusual, perhaps simply not a match for the specific community where you grew up, that was never fully seen and fully accepted. The brain learned the lesson that available inclusion will not last, that the outsider feeling is more reliable than the belonging feeling, and it keeps applying that lesson to every new room, every new group, every new chance at connection, before anything happens to confirm it. Here is the neuroscience of why belonging, when it is felt, feels the way it does, and why its absence produces a response that goes well beyond social disappointment. Your brain has been shaped by millions of years of evolution in social groups. For the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, group membership was not a social preference. It was a survival mechanism. The resources, the protection, the cooperative labor that made human survival possible, were all mediated through the group. To be outside the group, to be genuinely alone in a landscape where threats were real and individual survival was difficult, was to face dramatically increased risk. The brain evolved a solution, a monitoring system specifically designed to track belonging status, to register any signs of potential exclusion with urgency, to motivate the behaviors that would secure and maintain group membership. That system is the same social pain network that activates during physical injury, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, documented in research by Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA. When you feel outside, when the sense of not belonging is present, these regions activate, the same regions that process a wound, not as a metaphor, as a biological response to what the brain classifies as a genuine threat. The belonging system is also, critically, a self-reinforcing loop. When belonging is felt, when the brain registers genuine inclusion, oxytocin and dopamine release. Anxiety decreases, the social monitoring system relaxes, the person can be more fully present, more open, more capable of the authentic engagement that deepens connection. When belonging is not felt, when the brain is running the outsider prediction, cortisol rises. The social monitoring system activates. The person becomes hypervigilant to exclusion cues. Cognitively occupied by the monitoring, they are less present, less open, less available for the authentic engagement that would produce the belonging they are looking for. The not belonging state actively prevents the experiences that would resolve it. You cannot fully be in a room when part of your brain is watching the room for evidence that you should leave. Here is where it gets more specific. Because not all belonging uncertainty looks the same, and the specific form it takes tells you something important about where it came from. For some people, the outsider feeling is identity-based. It connects to a specific dimension of who they are, their background, their interests, their values, their way of thinking, that was not represented or was actively unwelcome in the communities they grew up in. These are people who were genuinely different from their immediate context, who spent their formative years in environments where the particular version of themselves that felt most true was not legible or welcomed. The experience of not fitting in was not a distortion. It was accurate. But the brain, having learned that lesson from real experience, often continues applying it to contexts that are different, to rooms that actually do contain people like them, to groups that actually would welcome the full version of who they are, if they were willing to show it. The prior built from accurate early experience continues to misread the present. For other people, the outsider feeling is more global. It does not attach specifically to their identity characteristics. It is present even in groups that match them well, even with people who share their values and experiences and ways of seeing the world. This form of belonging uncertainty often connects to early attachment experiences rather than identity mismatch. Children who experienced inconsistent attachment, whose caregivers were sometimes present and sometimes not, whose belonging in the most fundamental relationship of their lives was uncertain, often develop a generalized belonging uncertainty that travels with them regardless of context, not because any specific group has excluded them, but because the brain learned, at the deepest developmental level, that belonging is not something that can be fully counted on, that it can be withdrawn, that it requires maintenance, that the feeling of being held might not last, and it applies that lesson everywhere, to every group, to every relationship, to every room. There is a concept in social psychology called the fresh start effect, the finding that new social contexts provide genuine opportunities for identity revision. That in a new group, with new people who have no prior model of who you are, you can be whoever you currently are rather than whoever the people who knew you before believed you to be. This should be good news for people who never felt they belonged where they started. And in some ways it is. But the research on belonging uncertainty complicates it. Walton studies found that people high in belonging uncertainty do not fully take advantage of fresh start opportunities because they arrive in the new context with the old prior. The hypervigilance activates before anyone has done anything to warrant it. The monitoring for exclusion cues begins before any exclusion has occurred. The interpretive framework that converts ambiguous social signals into evidence of not fitting in is already running. And the authentic, unguarded self that would actually allow genuine connection to form, the version that would let people see who you actually are and respond to that, stays behind the monitoring. Because showing it feels like a risk. Because the last time you showed it in some earlier room, it was not fully received. So you show a curated version, easier to manage, safer to present. And then you wonder why the room full of people who should be your people doesn't feel like belonging. It doesn't feel like belonging because they have not met you yet. They have met the version of you that came prepared not to be hurt again. And that version, however competent and likable, is not the version capable of belonging. Because belonging requires the thing you have been most careful not to show. There is a study by Walton and Jeffrey Cohen at Stanford that documented something simple and powerful. Students entering college, a period of maximum belonging uncertainty for most people, were given a brief intervention. They read accounts from older students describing how their own sense of not fitting in had eventually resolved, how the feelings of being an outsider had been present early and had given way, over time, to genuine connection. The message was simple. What you are feeling is normal and temporary. That was the entire intervention, one piece of information, delivered once. Students who received it, particularly students from backgrounds underrepresented in higher education, who had the strongest prior toward belonging uncertainty, showed measurably better academic performance and well-being across the following year compared to control groups. Not because the information was profound, because it interrupted the self-reinforcing loop. The belonging uncertainty produces hypervigilance, which produces reduced authentic engagement, which produces reduced connection, which confirms the belonging uncertainty. The single piece of information, what you are feeling is normal and temporary, created enough of a gap in that loop to allow the other process to begin. The process of actually being present, actually showing up, actually letting the room see who you are rather than who you are when you are afraid. The loop can be interrupted, not by finding the perfect group, not by becoming more socially skilled, not by working harder to fit in, by understanding that the feeling of not belonging is often not evidence of not belonging. It is evidence of a prior, a brain that learned to expect exclusion before this specific room had done anything to warrant it. And when the prior is recognized for what it is, a lesson from a different context being applied to this one, the grip of it loosens slightly. Slightly is enough to begin. There is one more piece of this that the research documents with particular clarity. The people who eventually develop a stable sense of belonging, who find their way out of the chronic outsider feeling, do not do it by finding the perfect environment. They do it by changing what they bring to every environment. Research by Brené Brown at the University of Houston, built across years of qualitative and quantitative study, identified a specific distinction that her research participants drew between belonging and fitting in. Fitting in is adjusting yourself to match what you believe the group expects, presenting the version of yourself most likely to be accepted. Monitoring, calibrating, performing. Belonging is being accepted as you actually are, without the adjustment, without the monitoring, without the performance. And her finding was that these two experiences are not just different in degree, they are opposite in kind. The pursuit of fitting in, the relentless calibration of self-presentation to maximize acceptance, actively undermines belonging. Because fitting in requires concealing the exact things that genuine belonging would accept. The person who is always fitting in is always, by definition, not being known. And you cannot belong to a group that has not met you. The chronic outsider feeling, in many cases, is not the experience of genuine exclusion. It is the experience of a person who has been fitting in so successfully that they have never found out whether they could actually belong. The belonging has not been tried. The risk of showing the full self, the one that might not be accepted, the one that was not accepted before, the one that learned to manage its presentation carefully, has not been taken. And the monitoring, the calibration, the careful performance of acceptability has been mistaken for evidence that no room could hold the real thing. It is not evidence of that. It is evidence of never having tested it. The room that would have you as you actually are exists. It may be smaller than you hoped. It may require patience to find. But the research is consistent that genuine belonging, the specific, settled, no longer monitoring experience of being fully accepted, becomes possible the moment the performance stops, not after you find the perfect group. The moment you decide the current group is worth the risk of being known by. That decision is yours. It has always been yours. If the science behind why you feel what you feel matters to you, the real research, explained without the noise, subscribe. No easy answers about community or connection, just the psychology and neuroscience that actually holds up, and what it means for the way you navigate belonging. The next video goes into why some people feel chronically misunderstood, and what the research says about whether that feeling is a perception problem or a communication problem. Hit subscribe. That one is worth staying for. There is a specific finding from the belonging research that most people who experience chronic outsider feelings need to hear directly. The feeling of not belonging is not distributed equally across all people in any given room. In studies where participants rate their sense of belonging after a social interaction, the ratings are almost always more negative than the ratings of the people they interacted with. Specifically, the people who felt least like they belonged rated the interaction as significantly less warm, less connected, and less welcoming than the people they were interacting with rated the same interaction. Both parties attended the same event, had the same conversation, were in the same room. The person high in belonging uncertainty experienced it as significantly less warm than the person they were talking to actually felt it was. This is not a minor discrepancy. It is a systematic perceptual bias. The belonging uncertain brain processes social information through a filter calibrated to find evidence of exclusion. It notices the moment of silence before the laugh, the glance across the room during the conversation, the slightly distracted tone in someone's voice, and it weights these signals heavily as potential evidence of what it already expects. The warmth, which was also present, often in greater quantity, registers more weakly. Because the brain is not looking for warmth, it is watching for the withdrawal. This means that the room you left feeling like an outsider may have experienced you quite differently. The people in it may have found you interesting, warm, worth knowing more. They may not have shown it in the specific, unambiguous ways your hypervigilant social monitoring system was waiting for. But that does not mean the belonging was not there. It means your filter was not positioned to detect it. Research by Margaret Clark and Judson Mills at Carnegie Mellon University documented what they called communal relationships, relationships characterized by genuine concern for each other's well-being rather than a transactional exchange. People who are high in belonging uncertainty consistently underestimate the degree to which they are in communal relationships with others. They interpret the same social behavior, someone checking in, asking how they are, remembering something they mentioned previously, as less indicative of genuine care than people with secure belonging read the identical behavior. The care is present. The belonging is available. The belonging uncertain person cannot fully receive it, not because it was never offered, because the receiving system is impaired. This is perhaps the most important finding in all of this. The obstacle to belonging, for many chronic outsiders, is not the unavailability of belonging. It is the perceptual system that cannot register it when it is there. The same system that learned, in earlier and more genuinely excluding environments, to discount evidence of inclusion as temporary, as conditional, as not to be trusted. That system, brought forward into new rooms, keeps failing to register what is actually there, and the person walks away from room after room concluding that they do not belong, when what actually happened is that the belonging was present, and the system responsible for feeling it was not working. That is a different problem than being genuinely excluded, and it has a different solution. Not finding better rooms, repairing the system that reads them. There is one final thing worth saying before this ends, because the research, while clarifying, can also produce a specific kind of frustration. If the problem is a perceptual system that cannot register belonging, if the obstacle is a prior built from real but past experiences of exclusion, if the solution is showing up more fully and allowing yourself to be known, all of that is true, and none of it is easy. Knowing that the system is impaired does not repair it. Understanding that the prior is inaccurate does not automatically update it. Recognizing that fitting in has been preventing belonging does not immediately make showing up as yourself feel safe. The research is not asking you to fix this overnight, or through willpower, or through a decision made once and held consistently. It is describing a process, a gradual one, with setbacks, with rooms that really do not have a place for you, alongside rooms that do, with moments of genuine connection that get discounted by the old filter and have to be recalled deliberately. But a process that moves, that changes, that produces, over time and with accumulation, a different relationship with the question of whether you belong. Gregory Walton's research found that the belonging intervention, the simple information that what you are feeling is normal and temporary, worked not because it eliminated belonging uncertainty, but because it changed how people interpreted their experience of it. The uncertainty was still present. The outsider feeling still arrived. But it was held differently. Not as evidence. As a feeling that was familiar, that had a cause, that was not reporting accurately on the current situation. A feeling that could be noticed and not followed all the way to the conclusion it was pulling toward. That is what understanding does. Not eliminate the feeling. Give you somewhere to stand while you have it, so that the next time you are in a room where you should feel at home and the outsider feeling arrives before anyone has done anything to warrant it, you know what you are dealing with. A prior. A brain that learned its lesson somewhere else and has not yet received enough evidence to update it. And you stay in the room a little longer. You show a little more of who you actually are. You let the belonging that might be available there have a chance to reach you. Not because it is guaranteed to work, but because the alternative, watching from the edge of every room that was ever built to include you, has already been tried. And it has not worked either.